They locked the gate, and they left her on the wrong side of it. The guards ran, their faces white with a terror no warrior should ever wear, and not one of them looked back. Not one of them remembered the small gray woman still standing in the dark. Then the growling started, low, deep, a sound that was not quite a growl at all, more like a mountain deciding whether to split open. She turned, and in the black mouth of the vault, two eyes opened, violet fire, burning through the gloom, fixing on her small, trembling frame with a hunger that had nothing human left in it. The most dangerous creature in the world was locked in a cage, and she was locked in there with him. She had spent her whole life being invisible, and now the one time it might have saved her, the monster had already seen her. There are places in the old mountain keep where the light never reaches. Cold stone, damp air, corridors carved so deep into the rock that even sound seemed afraid to travel there. And through those corridors moved a woman no one ever saw. Her name was Wren. She walked the way falling snow walks, quiet, weightless, leaving no mark behind. Her footsteps made no echo on the black stone floors. Her scent, faint as rain on cold rock, dissolved before anyone could catch it. To the rest of the pack, she was less than a shadow. She was a gap in the room, a space people looked past on their way to someone who mattered. And for a long time, Wren told herself that she liked it that way. She really did try to believe it. The unseen do not get hurt. The forgotten do not get chosen, but they do not get thrown away either. There was a strange kind of safety in being nothing. No one expected anything from a ghost. No one demanded, no one judged, no one turned their sharp eyes toward a girl who carried cleaning cloths and kept her gaze on the floor. But down beneath the safety, underneath all that careful stillness, there was an ache. The particular ache of a woman who has spent her whole life waiting for one single person to look at her and actually see her, and never being seen. She had learned over the years to shrink herself into the smallest possible shape, to speak only when spoken to, which was almost never, to move through a crowded hall as though she were made of the same cold air everyone else was breathing. There was an art to it, and she had mastered it so completely that some mornings she wondered whether she had ever truly existed at all, or whether she was only the memory of a girl the world had already finished forgetting. That morning, the keep was not quiet. Something was wrong. Everyone could feel it, humming in the air like a struck wire. The great stone walls were trembling, not from wind, not from storm, from him. High in the tower above them all, the king was losing. Cassian Thorn, ruler of the pack, the most powerful alpha their bloodline had produced in generations, and the most cursed. The old ones had a name for what was eating him alive. They called it the Ravage, a fire in the blood that came for the strongest of their kind, a madness that burned a wolf from the inside until nothing human remained. For weeks now, his roars had rolled down through the stone like thunder trapped underground. Wren felt each one in her teeth. She felt them in the small bones of her hands, because there was something in the sound that no one else seemed to hear. Underneath the rage, underneath the terror of it, there was pain, raw and endless and utterly alone. It was the sound of someone drowning, and no one brave enough to reach in and pull him out. The other servants had stopped speaking of him above a whisper. When his cries came down through the stone, they would pause in their work, exchange a frightened glance, and then bend their heads lower and move a little faster, as though speed alone could carry them out of the reach of that terrible sound. They pitied him. In the distant way, people pity a storm on a far horizon. But none of them heard what Wren heard in it. None of them heard the boy underneath the beast calling out from the bottom of a well no one would climb into. That morning, her chores took her down past the armory, down past the iron doors, down toward the lowest vault, where the air turned cold enough to see her breath, and the silence pressed against her ears like water. She preferred it there. The deep places asked nothing of her. She was carrying her bucket, her mind drifting to the small hidden garden she kept near the servants' quarters, when the mountain screamed. It was not an earthquake. It was worse. A sound of metal being torn like wet paper. A wave of heat that rolled up the corridor and made the moisture on the walls hiss into steam. The bucket fell from her hands. Water spread across the stone, and where the heat touched it, it vanished. Then came the guards. They came around the corner at a dead run, elite warriors of the king's own guard, and their faces were white with a terror Wren had never seen on a fighter before. They did not see her. They never saw her. They only saw the great iron gate at the end of the hall, and they threw themselves toward it, and they hauled it shut. The bolts slammed home. 1, 2, 3. The sound rang down the tunnel like a bell tolling for the dead, and Wren stood there, on the wrong side of the bars. She opened her mouth. She lifted a hand toward the gate. The words rose in her throat. Wait. She was still there, still inside. But the words never came, because behind her, in the dark of the vault, something began to breathe. A low vibration started in the blackness, so deep it was not a sound at all. It was a pressure, a weight against her spine, against her ribs, against the soft place at the base of her skull. It was the sound a mountain might make, a moment before it split open. Slowly, so slowly, Wren turned, and in the shadows of the vault mouth, 2 eyes opened, violet fire, burning through the gloom, and they were fixed on her. Deep inside the vault, there was almost nothing left of the man who had once been king. Cassian could feel himself dissolving. Every breath was molten, every heartbeat a hammer against the inside of his skull. The ravage had him now, fully, and it wanted only one thing: to burn, to find something soft and living and make it stop. He had thrown himself against the walls until his claws left deep furrows in the black rock, because the pain was the only rope still tying him to the world. As long as it hurt, he was still someone. As long as it hurt, he had not yet become only the beast. But the rope was fraying. Somewhere in the last human corner of his mind, a small voice was still counting the losses. His name. He could still remember his name. He could still remember the shape of his own hands, the sound of his mother's voice from a childhood so distant it felt like something he had read about rather than lived. He clung to those things the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. And one by one, the fire was prying his fingers loose. And then, through the fire and the roar, something reached him. A scent, faint, almost nothing, cool as the first snowfall on a winter night, clean as water rising from deep stone. It should not have been there. Nothing living came to this place. The beast turned toward it, hungry, and the man inside the beast turned toward it too, though he could not have said why. His eyes found her, a small figure, pressed to the wall, trembling. To the wolf, she was a target, a way to let the pressure out. He moved. The floor cracked beneath him as he crossed the vault in a single heartbeat, faster than thought, his hand rising toward the pale line of her throat. Wren did not run. There was nowhere to run. She looked up into that violet fire, and she saw no mercy there, no man, only a storm searching for something to strike. The guards were not coming back. She understood that now, with a strange, quiet clarity. They had locked the gate to keep the monster in, and they had left her inside as the price. She had been given away, and no one had even noticed she was gone. Something in her chest broke at that. It was not even fear in that final moment. It was something older and sadder than fear. It was the grief of a life about to end exactly as it had been lived, unseen, unmourned. A ghost who would simply stop haunting the halls, and no one would think to ask where she had gone. And something else. Rose. A cold, rhythmic pulse she had felt only in small flickers her whole life. The quiet thing that had always made her different. The stillness that had kept her separate from the fire and fury of her own kind. It came now, rushing to her fingertips like an icy river breaking free. She did not think. She did not plan. Driven by something older than fear, she lifted her hand into the heat that should have blistered her skin, and she pressed her fingers against his burning arm. And the world stopped, the roar cut off, the heat drained away, pulled into her like water into dry earth. The terrible violet light flickered, dimmed, and behind it, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Cassian saw. He saw the vault. He saw the dark. He saw her. A woman with tired eyes and a steady hand, doing the impossible without even seeming to know it. The silence in his mind was so sudden, so complete, that it brought tears he did not understand. For months there had been no silence, only the endless roar, the grinding pressure, the voice of the beast howling for release. And now, all at once, there was nothing. A quiet so deep and so kind that it felt like the first cool water after a lifetime of thirst. He had forgotten that his own mind could be a place he wanted to live in. She had given that back to him with a single touch, and she did not even seem to know what she had done. He looked down at her, this stranger, this ghost, and Wren looked back, not at the floor, not past him, at him. For the first time in her life, someone was looking straight into her and did not look away. Neither of them moved. In the ruined dark of the vault, the king who could silence armies stood breathing hard, held together by the touch of a woman the whole world had chosen not to see. The silence held. Long after the violet had faded from his eyes, long after his breathing had slowed to something almost human, Cassian did not let her go. His hand had come up to cover hers, pressing her palm harder against his skin, as if he was afraid that the moment she pulled away, the fire would come rushing back and swallow him whole. And Wren did not know what to do with the way he was looking at her. She knew how to be invisible. She had spent her whole life perfecting it, but she did not know how to be seen. "Touch me," he said. His voice was a low rasp, worn raw from weeks of roaring. It was not a request. It was not even a command exactly. It was the sound of a drowning man asking for the one thing keeping him above the water. The noise. It stops when you touch me. His fingers tightened over hers. You are not going anywhere. Ren's heart began to race. And this time, it was not from the monster. It was from something far more dangerous. It was from being wanted. They came for her within the hour, not to punish her, not to throw her back into the forgotten corners where she belonged. They came to move her up. Ren was taken from the cold lower halls to a suite of rooms in the royal wing, chambers dripping with velvet and dark polished wood, air thick with expensive oils and rare smoke. To anyone else, it would have looked like a reward. To her, it looked like a beautiful cage. She stood in the center of a thick woven rug in her worn servant's clothes, and she felt like a plain gray bird that had been dropped into a palace of gold, left to wait for the predator to come back and decide what she was for. She did not touch anything. She was afraid to. The furniture looked like it belonged to a different kind of person, a person who was allowed to exist loudly, a person who took up rooms and light and the attention of the whole world without ever once apologizing for it. Ren had never been that person. She had spent her life making herself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook, and now she stood in a room built to be noticed, and did not know how to fit inside her own life. A while later, a servant came to bring her fresh clothes. Ren knew her. Her name was Mirren, an older woman with worn hands and a kind, tired face, one of the few who had ever spoken to Ren at all in the long years below. They had shared 100 quiet meals in the servants' hall, never quite friends, but something close to it. 2 women the world had passed over, keeping each other company in the passing over. But the woman who stepped into the royal suite that evening was not the Mirren she knew. This Mirren kept her eyes down. She set the folded clothes on the bed with careful, formal hands, and she dipped her head in a small bow, and she called Ren my lady in a voice gone thin and strange. Myron, Ren said, it is only me. You do not have to. But Mirren would not meet her eyes. Things are different now, my lady, she said quietly. You are not one of us anymore. It would not be proper. And she bowed again, and she left. Ren stood alone in the enormous room, holding the soft clothes she had not asked for, and she felt the strangest ache open up in her chest. She had spent her whole life wishing to be seen. And now that the world had finally turned to look at her, the first thing it had done was take away the one small warmth she had ever been allowed to have. She understood, in that quiet moment, that being lifted up was its own kind of loneliness, that a golden cage was still a cage, and that the higher the world raised her, the further it would place her from every ordinary comfort she had ever known. The whole keep was already talking. She could feel it through the walls, the whispers, the turning heads, the sudden silences that fell whenever the guards led her past. A servant, a nothing, a girl with no scent and no standing closer to the throne than any of them had ever been allowed. They looked at her with a strange mixture of awe and hunger and something colder underneath. Resentment. How, their eyes demanded, how could a creature so far beneath them hold something the strongest healers in the pack had failed to find? Ren kept her gaze low and her hands still. But under the surface, a small and unfamiliar thought was beginning to take shape. They see me now. For the first time in her entire life. They all see me. And it terrified her more than the darkness ever had. Because to be seen was to be judged. To be seen was to be measured against every whispered doubt in every corridor of the keep. And Wren had no illusions about what they saw when they looked at her. A pale, plain thing. No power in her scent. No name worth speaking. She had always believed that if the world ever truly looked at her, it would find nothing there. And now the world was looking. That evening, he came to her door. Cassian filled the room the moment he entered it, the way a storm fills a valley. He had bathed, dressed in the dark, regal cloth of his station, but his amber eyes still carried that restless flicker, that hunger for stillness that only seemed to ease when they landed on her. For a long moment, he said nothing. He only paced, back and forth along the length of the room, like a caged animal, his gaze tracking every small movement she made, and Wren, who had spent her life being overlooked, found she did not know how to stand under the weight of so much attention. "You could have run," he said at last. She looked up. "When the beast had me, when my hand was at your throat." His voice was quiet, almost wondering. Any sane creature would have run. Wren was silent for a moment. Then, softly, "There was nowhere to run." "No." He shook his head slowly. "That is not why you stayed." And he was right. She had not stayed because she was trapped. She had stayed because she had heard it, that drowning sound underneath the rage, and something in her had refused to let another living thing drown alone, because she knew what it felt like, to be left on the wrong side of a locked gate, to scream and have no one come. She did not say any of that, but somehow, looking at his face, she understood that he had heard it anyway. He stopped pacing. He came to stand before her, close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his eyes, and the heat of him rolled over her, no longer the soul-scorching fire of the beast, but a low, human warmth that made her breath catch. "From this moment," he said, "your only duty is to stay near me." His voice dropped. "The court is a pit of vipers, little ghost, and you have just become the most valuable thing in this whole mountain. They will smile at you, and they will look for the softest place to put the knife." He lifted a hand, slow, and let it hover near her cheek, not quite touching, as if he were fighting the urge to anchor himself to her all over again. "Trust no one," he said. "Do you understand?" Wren looked up at him, at the exhaustion under his eyes, the scars mapping the edge of his jaw, the terrible loneliness of a man who had spent his life waiting to be put down like a rabid animal. "I understand," she whispered, and she did. She understood him better than he knew. Cassian did not sleep well that night. He lay awake in his own chambers, listening to the wind carve its way through the peaks, and for the first time in longer than he could recall, the noise in his head was quiet. It should have been a relief. Instead, it frightened him, because a king who needed nothing was safe. A king who needed nothing could not be threatened, could not be broken, could not be used. But a king who needed a woman, a small, scentless, forgotten woman he had known for less than a day. That king had just handed the whole world a blade to press against his throat. He turned his face toward the wall between their rooms. He could not catch her from here. Her scent was too faint, too clean, a whisper of rain that dissolved before it reached him. and somehow that made it worse, because he found himself straining for it anyway. Fool, he told himself. She is a tool, a cure, nothing more. But even as he thought it, he knew it was already a lie. Because it was not her touch he kept returning to, in the dark behind his eyes. It was the look on her face in the vault. The way she had lifted her hand into a fire that should have killed her, and had not flinched. The way she had looked at him afterward, not with fear, not with the greedy calculation he saw in every other face in his kingdom, but with recognition, as though she had seen something in him worth saving. No one had looked at him like that in years. Perhaps no one ever had. The days that followed taught Ren what it meant to be the king's shadow. She was to stay near him, always, close enough to reach, close enough to touch. At first, she thought it would feel like servitude, one more chore among many. Stand here, be still, wait to be useful. But it was not like that, because when she was near him, he was different. The tremble left his hands, the scorched edge left his scent, softening back to something deep and clean, like pine after rain. The court noticed it too. They watched the way the terrible king steadied whenever the gray little ghost stepped close, and they did not understand it, and it made them afraid. And through all of it, Ren felt herself changing, not into someone new, into someone she had always been, and never been allowed to be. She began to lift her eyes when people spoke to her. She began to walk down the center of a corridor instead of pressing herself to the wall. Small things, almost nothing. But each one felt like reclaiming a small piece of ground that had been taken from her before she was old enough to fight for it. The test came at the gathering of rival alphas. They came under the pretense of talks, peace and borders, and old grievances laid to rest. But everyone in the great hall knew the truth. They had come to watch the Mad King crack. They had heard the rumors of his unraveling, and they wanted to see it with their own eyes, to smell the weakness on him, to know whether the mountain still had teeth. Cassian sat at the head of the long stone table, and to any outside eye he looked like carved iron, cold, unmovable, in perfect command. But Ren, standing behind his chair in the shadows where she had spent her whole life, could feel the truth of it. She could feel the tremors starting, the heat building beneath his skin, wave after wave. His scent was changing, deep pine giving way to scorched earth. The ravage was waking, and the alphas at the table could sense blood in the water. One of them leaned forward. A hard man with a jagged scar across his throat, his voice smooth and poisonous. He questioned whether a wolf who could not master himself had any right to sit at the head of any table. The words were chosen to wound, to provoke, to make the beast come out where everyone could see it. The air in the hall went taut, static, the pressure of a coming storm. Ren watched Cassian's knuckles go white where they gripped the arms of his chair. She watched the violet begin to bleed into the gold of his eyes, and she understood, in that single frozen breath, that if the king shifted now, it would mean war. No one gave her permission. No one ever would have. A servant did not step forward at a gathering of kings. A ghost did not touch the ruler of the pack in front of the most powerful wolves in the world. Ren did it anyway, and this time, this was the part that mattered. She did it because she chose to, not because she was ordered, not because she was trapped in a vault with nowhere left to go. She saw a man about to lose himself and a hall about to burst into flame, and she decided, in the quiet of her own heart, that she would not stand by and let it happen. She took one quiet step, then another, and she reached out, slid her hand beneath the heavy fabric of his cloak, and pressed her bare fingers to the warm skin at the back of his neck. The effect was instant. The room did not go cold, but the jagged, vibrating fury pouring off of him smoothed, softened into a low, steady hum. His breathing slowed. The violet drained from his eyes like a tide pulling back from the shore, leaving only clear, human gold behind. And every alpha at that table went silent. They had come to see a monster. Instead, they were watching a king held together by the touch of a girl with no scent, no name, no standing at all. Ren could feel their eyes on her hand. She could feel the whole shape of the room change around her, the balance tilting, the confusion and the alarm rippling outward like rings in still water. She had just made herself visible to every dangerous creature in the room, and there was no taking it back. Cassian felt her touch land like cool water on a burn, and something in his chest, something that had been locked and starving for years, turned toward it helplessly. He should have been furious. She had overstepped publicly. She had shown the entire assembly that the king of the mountain could be steadied by a servant's hand, had laid his greatest weakness bare in front of his enemies. He should have been furious. Instead, he reached up. He covered her hand with his own, there in front of all of them, and pressed her palm harder against his pulse. A claim. He turned his gaze back to the scarred alpha who had tried to bait him, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, cold enough to frost the stone. He offered terms that left no room for argument, and for the rest of that long, tense gathering, he did not let go of her hand. He drew her around to stand at his side instead, in full view, where the shadows could no longer hide her. Ren stood there, exposed, trembling, and slowly, something in her stopped being afraid, because his hand was warm around hers, because his thumb moved, just once, across her knuckles, a small and secret thing no one else could see, because for the length of that touch, she was not a ghost, or a tool, or a shadow in a hall full of giants. She was a woman standing beside a king, and she felt, for the first time in a life spent disappearing, that she took up space in the world, that she mattered. When the rivals finally filed out, thwarted and uneasy, Cassian turned to look at her. The gratitude in his eyes was real, but underneath it, something darker was already stirring, something possessive, something hungry. He was not just grateful for the peace she gave him, he was beginning to need it, and need, for a man like him, was the most dangerous thing in the world. He looked at her a moment longer than he should have. Then, low, meant only for her. "You keep stepping toward the fire, little ghost." Ren met his eyes, and this time, she did not look away. "Someone has to," she said. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The great hall had emptied around them. The torches guttered low. And in that hush, something passed between the king and the woman the world had chosen never to see. Something that had nothing to do with curses or duty or the fire in his blood. It was the simplest, most dangerous thing of all. It was the beginning of being known, and in the quiet that followed, Both of them understood that whatever this was, it had already stopped being about duty. The keep had a second in command, and his name was Damon. He was a warrior, born and bred. Loyalty ran through him the way water runs through stone, slow and deep and impossible to move. For years he had stood at Cassian's right hand, had watched his king fight a war that no man was ever meant to win. And he did not believe in miracles. He certainly did not believe in a servant girl who appeared out of nowhere with a cure the wisest healers in the pack had failed to find. To Damon, Ren was not a blessing. She was a variable, a soft place in the armor of a mountain that could not afford to be soft. He found her in the darkened gallery. She was walking toward the royal gardens, alone, when a hand shot out of the shadows and pulled her into a narrow alcove between two cold pillars. Ren gasped. Her back hit the stone, and there was Damon, filling the space in front of her, his broad frame a wall of muscle and old anger, his face inches from hers. He did not strike her. He did not need to. His presence alone was enough to pin her there, the way a hawk's shadow pins a small thing to the ground. "What are you?" he said, low, hard. "What kind of dark thing are you, to crawl into his mind and put it to sleep?" "I am not," she started. He was a force of nature. Damon's voice cracked just slightly, and Ren heard something underneath the fury that she had not expected. He ruled through fear, because fear was all that kept the others in line. And now he spends his nights soothed by a shadow, and his days dreaming of peace. And I am supposed to call that a cure? "I have no magic," Ren whispered. "No hidden purpose. I do not understand it any better than you do. I only know that when I touch him, the noise stops. That is all." "That is all," he repeated bitterly. And for a moment, the mask slipped. Because Damon was not lying when he said he had seen wolves lose themselves. He had seen it up close. He had loved someone once, long before the servant girl, long before the king's slow unraveling. And he had watched that someone die under the claws of a ruler who could not hold his own beast at bay. He had held her while the light went out of her eyes. And he had made himself a promise in that hour. A promise carved so deep into him that it had become the shape of his whole life. Never again. Never again would he stand by and let a wolf's weakness cost innocent blood. So when he looked at Ren, he did not see a woman. He saw the soft place where the next disaster would grow. He saw a king going gentle at exactly the moment the mountain needed its teeth. And he was afraid, not for himself, for everyone who would die if the great beast in the tower ever slipped its leash while its keeper was looking the other way. "You think you are saving him," Damon said, quieter now. "You are only teaching him to lean. And a wolf that leans falls. And when he falls, girl, he will not fall alone. He will take every soul in this keep down with him." Ren's voice trembled, but her spine did not. "And what would you have him do?" she asked. "Suffer alone? Burn alive inside his own skin, every hour of every day, because you have decided that pain is safer than peace?" Damon went very still. "You do not know," he said, "what you are meddling with." "Perhaps not." She lifted her chin. "But I know what it is to be left alone in the dark. And I would not wish it on anyone, not even a king, not even to make you feel safe." Something flickered across his face. For one breath, he looked less like an executioner and more like a man drowning in a grief he had never been allowed to set down. He opened his mouth, as if there were something more he wanted to say, some truth he had carried alone for too long. Then heavy footsteps echoed through the gallery, a rhythmic, deliberate tread that made the very air change. Damon released her at once and stepped back into the light, just as Cassian rounded the corner. The king's eyes moved between them. His nostrils flared as he caught the scent of Damon's aggression and Ren's fear tangled together in the narrow space, and the temperature in the corridor dropped to something lethal. The two most powerful men in the pack stood facing one another over the small gray woman between them. Cassian did not ask what had happened. He simply stepped forward and drew Ren behind his back, his body a wall between her and his own second in command. "If you ever put your hands on her again," he said, and his voice was terribly soft, "your rank will not save you." Damon met his king's eyes, and for a moment Ren was certain he would argue, that all the fear and grief and fury in him would come pouring out. Instead, he bowed his head. The gesture was correct, formal, perfect. But the look in his eyes when he lifted them one last time toward Ren was as sharp and cold as a blade left out in the snow. He stepped aside to let them pass, and as Ren followed the king toward the safety of the royal wing, she felt Damon's gaze burning into her back like a brand. Two fires now, the king who needed her, and the warrior who would destroy her to save them all. She did not tell Cassian what Damon had said. She was not sure why. Perhaps because she had seen the grief beneath the threat, and something in her could not bring herself to sharpen the king's fury against a man who was, in his own broken way, only trying to protect the people he loved. Or perhaps because she understood him. She who had spent a lifetime being the thing that others overlooked and misjudged, knew exactly how it felt to be seen wrongly. To have the whole of who you were reduced to a single frightening word. Monster, they had called Cassian. Parasite, Damon had called her. Neither word was true, and both had been spoken by people who were simply afraid. Ren carried that thought with her, quiet and heavy, as the days wore on. She found him again a few days later, though this time it was she who found him. It was late, and she could not sleep, and she had wandered to the high battlements to breathe the cold, clean air. And there was Damon, standing alone at the wall, staring out at the dark where the border lay. She almost turned back. Every sensible part of her said to turn back, but she did not. She crossed the stone and came to stand a few paces from him, close enough to speak, far enough to run. For a long while, neither of them said anything. The wind moved between them. Below, the pines whispered in the dark. "You come up here every night," Ren said at last. It was not a question. She had noticed the way the unseen always notice things, from the corners. Damon did not look at her. "The keep is too full of sleeping people," he said. "Up here, I do not have to listen to how easily they rest, how little they know. You are keeping watch," she said softly, "over people who do not know they are being kept." Something in his jaw tightened. "Somebody has to," he said. And it was the same thing she had said to Cassian in the Great Hall, and they both heard it. And for a moment, the space between them was almost gentle. "She would have liked this view," Ren said. "She did not know where the courage came from. The one you lost." Damon went rigid. I told you not to speak of her. I know, Ren's voice did not rise, but you are carrying her all alone, and I do not think anyone has ever once helped you set her down. And I think that is why you look at me the way you do, because I am soft, and softness is what took her from you. For a moment she thought he would strike her. Instead, his shoulders bent, just slightly, as though the weight on them had grown too heavy to hold straight. She was small, he said. His voice had gone rough and low, the voice of a man speaking words he had kept sealed for years. Smaller than you, and when he lost control, she was simply in the wrong corridor at the wrong hour. It was not even cruelty. That is the thing no one understands. It was not a monster choosing to kill. It was only a wolf who could not hold himself, and a girl who happened to be there. He turned his head, and in the moonlight Ren saw that his eyes were wet. So do not tell me about the peace you bring him, he said, because I have seen exactly what happens the day the peace runs out, and I will not survive watching it twice. Ren said nothing. There was nothing to say. She only stood beside him in the cold, letting him be seen for one honest moment, and it was the closest the two of them would ever come to understanding each other. Then Damon straightened, and the mask came back down over his face like a portcullis falling. "Go inside," he said. "It is not safe for you out here." And Ren went, but she carried the truth of him with her all the way down the stairs. It sat in her chest like a stone, because she understood now that the man who would one day come for her was not a villain. He was only a wound that had never been allowed to heal. That night, the screaming started. It tore through the silence of the royal wing, a sound that was not human and not quite wolf, a sound of pure, unrefined agony that seemed to make the stone walls themselves weep. Ren was awake before she understood why. She was out of the heavy furs and across the cold floor before her mind had caught up with her body. Cassian, the guards outside his door, were frozen, pale, paralyzed with the kind of fear that a lifetime of training cannot cure, because the sounds coming from inside that room did not belong to any battle they had been taught to fight. They moved to stop her. She pushed past them. She did not know where the strength came from. She only knew that the drowning sound was back, worse than ever, and that every part of her was already running toward it. Inside, the room was chaos. Cassian was in the center of the great bed, his body arching in the grip of a violent seizure. He was half-shifted, caught in a nightmare that had reached up out of his own mind and taken physical form. His claws tore the silk sheets to ribbons. His skin glowed with that terrible heat, the fire that came just before the change, and the air in the room was so hot it scorched her throat. He was trapped somewhere she could not follow, somewhere made of fire and blood, reliving every moment of the madness he had endured before she had ever found him in the dark. His breath came in ragged, rattling gasps, and Ren understood, with a cold clarity, that no one else in this entire keep would come into this room to save him. Only her. She climbed onto the bed. She ignored the thrashing limbs. She ignored the claws that could open her from throat to hip with a single accidental strike. She threw herself across his chest. She wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed as much of her skin against his as she could, and the heat of him was nearly unbearable, like embracing a living forge. She did not let go. She whispered his name into his ear, soft, steady, a quiet rhythm against the roar of his internal storm. "Come back," she breathed. "Come back to me. You are not there anymore. You are here. I have you." The jagged energy of the nightmare poured into her, a cold shock of static that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. But she reached down into the still center of herself, into that cool and rhythmic pulse that was her birthright, and she held it open like a door, and she let the storm pour through her, and out, and away. Slowly, the thrashing stopped, his muscles unlocked, his breathing changed from frantic gasps to long, shuddering sighs. The heat began to drain away, leaving a cool dampness where sweat cooled on his skin. He opened his eyes. They were not the amber of the man, nor the violet of the beast. They were a dark, fractured honey, filled with a terror that broke something open in Ren's chest. His hands came up and gripped her waist, hard, desperate, grounding. He did not push her away, neither did she. The two of them lay tangled together in the ruins of the bed, the moonlight bleeding through the high windows, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. "In the dream," he said at last, his voice a broken whisper against her throat, "the Ravage won." She went still. "I watched myself destroy the only thing that ever brought me peace." His arms tightened around her. "I watched my own hands do it, and I could not stop them." Ren pressed her palm flat against his heart. "It was only a dream." "No." He pulled back just enough to look at her, and there was something raw in his eyes, something she suspected he had never shown another living soul. "It is the thing I am most afraid of. Not the pain, not even the dying. I have made my peace with dying." His jaw tightened. "I am afraid of the dark," he said. "Not because of what waits in it." He looked at her. "Because of what I become when I cannot see you." Ren did not have words for that, so she gave him the only thing she had. She stayed. She lay beside him with her hand over his heart, feeling the slow, steady rhythm return beneath her palm. And she did not leave when his breathing evened out. And she did not leave when his grip finally relaxed. And she did not leave when the moon climbed high and cold above the peaks. She was his anchor in the daylight. And now she understood. She was his anchor in the dark as well. And as he finally drifted into a peaceful sleep, his face buried in the crook of her neck, breathing in her scent of rain and cold stone, as if it were the only air he could stand. Ren lay awake. She stared up at the shadows moving across the vaulted ceiling, and she let herself feel the shape of what was happening to her. For her whole life, she had believed that being needed and being loved were two different things, and that she would only ever be granted the first, if she were granted anything at all. Useful. That was the most a ghost could hope to be. But the way he had said it, "Because of what I become when I cannot see you," that had not been the voice of a man who merely needed a tool. That had been the voice of a man who was afraid of losing her. And she wondered, lying there in the dark with his heartbeat under her hand, whether she would ever again be able to breathe without him. In the days that followed, something shifted between them. The bond was no longer only about the touch that quieted his storms. It had grown roots. It had grown teeth. They began to speak in the quiet hours. Small things at first. He asked about the little garden she had kept near the servants' quarters, and she was startled that he had known of it at all. She asked about the scars that mapped his chest, and for once he did not turn the question away. And Cassian, who had spent his whole life braced for his own execution, began to do a dangerous thing. He began to hope. It was in the training yard that they discovered the last of her secrets. He wanted to test something, a thing that most wolves would have called a cruelty. He stood 10 paces away from her, his chest bare, his expression unreadable, and he reached down into the deep and ancient well of his bloodline, the Alpha Command, the vocal authority that could bring the strongest warrior in the mountain to his knees in an instant. A power woven into the very bones of their kind, the thing that held their whole society together. He drew a breath, and he told her to kneel. The word was not a shout. It was a low-frequency vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and strike straight at the soul. The air in the yard rippled with the force of it. The birds in the far trees fell silent. The loose sand on the ground trembled. It was the sound of absolute dominance, the sound that defined every rung of the ladder their world was built on. Ren felt it pass through her, a strange, distant tingle, like the memory of a thunderstorm heard from very far away. And that was all. There was no crushing weight, no sudden weakness in her knees, no pull, no pressure, no drowning need to obey. She simply stood, head tilted, watching him with quiet curiosity. Cassian's eyes went wide. He tried again. He poured more of himself into the word, more intent, until the sand at his feet danced in strange, spiraling patterns. Ren blinked, and then she walked toward him. The closer she came, the more the pressure of the command seemed to dissolve, neutralized by the cool stillness that had always set her apart. She reached him. She placed a hand on his chest, over the frantic drumming of his heart, and the last echoes of his command vanished into nothing. He let out a low, stunned laugh. "You cannot be commanded," he said, wonder and something like grief mixing in his voice. "Not by me, not by anyone." He looked down at her small hand on his chest. "Do you understand what that means, little ghost? Every wolf in this world can be bent, broken, bound. But you," his thumb traced the back of her hand, "you are free." And Ren felt the truth of it settle into her bones, the very thing that had made them overlook her. The strange, quiet difference that had left her scentless and forgotten in the shadows all her life was not a flaw. It was a kind of freedom no other creature in the mountain would ever know. She could not be forced. She could only be asked. Something loosened in her chest at that. Something she had carried so long she had stopped noticing its weight. All her life, she had believed the world had passed her over because there was nothing in her worth stopping for. Now she understood the truth had been the opposite. The world had passed her over because it could not hold her, could not command her, could not bend her, could not fit her into any of the small boxes it used to keep everything else in its place. She had not been overlooked because she was less. She had been overlooked because she was other, and no one had ever bothered to learn the difference. The thought did not make her bitter. It made her stand a little taller. For Cassian, the realization landed like a blow he had not braced for, because it meant he could never make her stay. He could never command her love, never compel her loyalty, never bind her to him with the ancient power that ruled everything else in his world. If she stayed, it would be because she chose to, every second of her time, every inch of her affection. He would have to earn all of it, the way a common man earns the heart of a woman he does not deserve. And looking down at her upturned face, this small, quiet, unbreakable creature who had walked into his fire and refused to burn. Cassian felt a new kind of fear, the kind a man feels when he realizes he has finally, hopelessly, met his match. There was a freedom in it for him too, though he did not yet know how to name it. For his whole life he had been surrounded by wolves who obeyed him because they had to, who bowed and scraped and told him only what his power demanded they say, but she owed him nothing. Every kind word from her mouth was true, because she could not be made to speak it. Every time she stayed because she wanted to. And that, he was beginning to understand, was worth more than 1,000 kingdoms full of the obedient. The peace did not last. It never did in that place. Word came on a cold wind 3 days later. A rival ruler named Rowan, Alpha of the lands to the south, had come to the border with a host of warriors at his back. He had heard the rumors, the mad king, the scentless girl, the strange new stillness in the mountain, and he had come to see for himself whether the great beast of the north had finally been tamed or finally been broken. The war room filled with tense voices. Damon stood among them, arguing for a swift and brutal answer, his hand never far from the hilt of his blade, his cold eyes flicking again and again to the woman at the king's side. Cassian stood at the high window instead, watching the distant torchlight gather at the edge of his territory, and Ren, close behind him, felt the old heat begin to rise beneath his skin, the ravage stirring, the storm gathering again. And this time, she understood, no locked vault and no quiet touch would be enough to keep it contained. Something was coming. A test of everything the two of them had only just begun to build. And deep in her bones, in that cool and ancient place that had always known things before her mind could catch up, Ren felt the first cold shiver of a warning. The real danger was not yet at the border. It was already inside these walls. Before he faced Roan, Cassian did something no king of the mountain had done in living memory. He took the girl into the wild. He led her out past the last of the guarded gates, into the ancient forest that ringed the keep, a place of towering pines and prehistoric silence, where the air was thick with damp earth and moss. He needed to burn off the pressure building in his blood before the parley. And he wanted her to see what their kind truly was, away from the suffocating stone of the court. For a little while, out there in the green shadow, the whole weight of the coming war seemed to lift. They walked without speaking for a long time, and it was a comfortable kind of quiet, the kind Ren had never been able to share with another living soul. The forest changed her. She felt it happening. With every step deeper into the green, some old, tight thing in her chest began to loosen. Out here, there were no whispering courtiers, no sharp eyes measuring her worth. There was only the wind and the smell of pine and cold earth, and the man walking beside her who kept slowing his long stride to match hers. She noticed that. The way he shortened his steps for her without seeming to think about it. Small things. But she had spent her whole life reading small things, because small things were all the world had ever given her to read. "You are staring," Cassian said, without turning his head. There was a rough warmth in it, almost teasing. "You keep slowing down," Ren said. "For me." Now he did look at her, and something flickered across his face, as though she had caught him at something he had not meant to reveal. "You are used to running to keep up," he said quietly. "Your whole life. Running to keep up and being left behind anyway." He stopped walking. "I am tired of watching people leave you behind." Ren's breath caught. He reached out, then, slow and careful, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers grazed the line of her jaw and lingered there. And it was such a small thing, such an ordinary tenderness, that it undid her more completely than any grand gesture could have. No one had ever touched her gently before him. Her whole life, touch had meant a hand shoving her aside in a crowded corridor, or nothing at all. But his fingers on her skin were unhurried, reverent, as though she were something worth taking time over. She had spent so many years believing her body took up too much space in a world that did not want her. And here was a man tracing the shape of her face, as though he were memorizing a thing he never wanted to forget. "There is that," he murmured. "You flinch when I am gentle, as though you are waiting for the gentleness to turn into something else." "It always did," Ren whispered. "Before you." His jaw tightened, and his thumb moved slowly across her cheek. "Not with me," he said. "Never with me." There was a confession in it, and they both knew it, but he did not press. He let his hand fall, and he offered it to her instead, palm open, and after a moment she laid her smaller hand inside it, and they walked on through the trees with their fingers laced together like two ordinary people who had never known a moment of fear in their lives. "There is something I have never told anyone," he said at last. They had stopped in a clearing where sunlight fell in golden shafts through the canopy. He sat with his back against a fallen tree, and Ren sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "My line burns out," he said. "Every firstborn alpha of my blood. The ravage is not a sickness that comes and goes. It is an inheritance, the raw, unrefined fire of the first wolves, passed down, growing hotter with every generation." His jaw tightened. "My ancestors rarely lived past their 30th year, their minds consumed by the very strength that made them kings." He looked down at his own scarred hands. "My father nearly took the whole keep with him when the madness finally claimed him. The council put him down before he could. I watched it happen, and I understood, that day, exactly how my own story was going to end." Ren said nothing. She only reached over and laced her fingers through his. "I spent my whole life preparing to die alone," he said quietly. "Braced for the moment my own men would have to end me. I treated my wolf like an enemy, a monster in a cage that I had to starve and beat into silence just to get through another day." He turned to look at her. "And then a ghost walked into my fire. And for the first time, the monster went quiet. Not because I forced it, because it finally found something it did not want to destroy." Ren's chest ached for the boy he had been, for the years he had spent certain he was born only to burn. She lifted their joined hands and pressed her lips to his knuckles. "You are not a monster with a man trapped inside it," she said softly. "You are a man who was handed a fire too big to carry alone." Something broke open in his face at that. He had spent his whole life believing the opposite. He reached up and cupped the back of her head and drew her forehead down to rest against his, and for a long moment They simply breathed the same air, and it was more intimate than any kiss. "When you say things like that," he murmured, "I almost believe them." "Then believe them," she whispered. "I will say them as many times as it takes." He rose then and offered her his hand. "Run with me," he said. He did not ask her to shift. He knew her ghost wolf nature made her change a quiet, inward thing, but he wanted her to feel it, the freedom, the wild. And then, in a single fluid motion that stole her breath, he shifted. Where the man had stood was now a massive creature of soot-colored fur and clear amber eyes, a predator that looked as though it had been carved from the mountain itself. He did not growl. He did not snap. He simply lowered his great head and thumped his tail once against the earth and waited for her. And Wren felt something ancient wake up in her own blood. A desire for freedom she had suppressed her whole life. She ran. They moved through the forest like twin shadows. Cassian kept an easy pace that let her stay beside him, and Wren found, to her astonishment, that her lack of scent made her nearly invisible to the creatures of the wood, letting her slip through the undergrowth faster than she had ever moved in her life. The wind was in her hair. Her heart pounded, not with fear now, but with something bright and wild and free. For the first time, she was not a servant, not a tool, not a shadow pressed into a corner. She was a wolf of the mountain, a part of the living world. And she felt Cassian watching her run with a look in his great amber eyes that could only be called pride. They reached a ridge overlooking a hidden waterfall, and there he shifted back, catching her in his arms as she slowed, and the two of them tumbled laughing into the tall grass. "I never loved this forest before," he confessed, breathing hard, her hair tangled in his fingers. "My wolf was always too loud to let me hear it, too full of rage to let me feel anything but the need to run from myself." He looked at her. "You made it quiet enough to love." She lay there against his chest, listening to the steady drum of his heart, feeling the sun on her face and the tall grass swaying around them, and she thought, with a fierce ache, that she would remember this exact moment for the rest of her life. However long or short that turned out to be. This one golden hour where she had been happy and free and held. The journey back was meant to be peaceful. The forest had other plans. They were following the narrow trail along the ridge when the air changed. The clean scent of pine gave way, all at once, to the acrid stench of burning sulfur. Cassian stopped dead, his hand flying to his sword, a low warning vibration rolling from his chest. And then the shapes came out of the trees. Roan's assassins, dressed in gray to melt into the rocks. They did not offer a challenge or a parley. They came in a coordinated rush, blades flashing, moving like men who had been tracking the king for hours. Cassian became a whirlwind of lethal motion. His strength amplified by the need to protect the woman at his back, he tore through the first line of them, his claws and blade leaving ruin in the dirt. Wren stayed close behind him, her eyes scanning the high rocks. And that was how she saw it. The glint of sunlight on metal, an instant before the arrow left the string. It was not aimed at Cassian. The shooter knew the king was too fast. It was aimed at her. She barely had time to gasp. The arrow struck her shoulder, and the force of it spun her to the ground, and a dark, sickly green stain began to spread across her dress. The sound that came out of Cassian was not human. He turned to see her crumpled on the forest floor, the fletching jutting from her flesh, the poison already blackening the veins around the wound. Silver nitrate and nightshade, a venom made to paralyze a shifter and rot the healing from their blood. And the ravage came roaring back, fueled by a grief so deep it threatened to swallow him whole. He cut down the last of the assassins without seeming to see them, and then he was on his knees at her side, gathering her broken body into his lap, and Ren watched the truth break across his face as though it were physically wounding him. He loved her, not as a tool, not as a cure, as the other half of his own soul. The return to the keep was a blur of crimson and cold terror. Cassian carried her through the gates at a run, ignoring the healers who rushed forward with their needles and tinctures, and shouldered his way into his own chambers, kicking the heavy doors shut behind him. He laid her on the furs, and his heart fractured at the sight of her. Her skin gray, the dark, necrotic veins spreading outward from her shoulder like a slow, creeping frost. The nightshade was a cruel death. It would paralyze the heart by degrees while keeping the mind awake to feel every second of the collapse. Standard medicine would be too slow. She was fading, her cool aura, the thing that had always defined her, flickering now like a candle in a gale. And then the king understood. Nightshade flourished in the cold. It slowed the blood until it turned to sludge. But it could not survive fire. And fire was the one thing Cassian had always had too much of, the very curse that had ruled his whole life, the heat that had made him a monster. Now it was the only thing in the world that could save her. He stripped off his shirt and pulled her against his bare chest, wrapping them both in the heavy furs to trap the heat. And then he did the thing he had spent his whole life fighting not to do. He called the ravage forward, not to shift, but to burn. He forced the fire up through his own skin, deliberately, willingly, letting the madness he had always caged come surging into his blood. His body temperature climbed to a level that would have killed an ordinary man. He became a living forge, and he held her against it, whispering her name into the crook of her neck, a broken plea for her to stay. Hours passed in a haze of sweat and shared breath. And here was the terrible price of it. Without her touch to ground him, the ravage clawed at his mind with every second, and he was the one holding it open, feeding it, letting it consume his sanity so that its heat could burn the venom from her veins. He was giving up his mind to save her life. Every time she let out a soft, pained sound, he pressed her closer, his tears mixing with the sweat on her brow. He watched, desperate, as the dark streaks on her shoulder began, slowly, to recede, as the sickly green faded back to the healthy cream of her skin. The fire was working, but the cost was climbing with every hour. He could feel himself slipping, feel the old madness settling into the spaces his sanity had held. His thoughts began to fracture, to smoke at the edges. Somewhere far away he could hear his own voice, no longer forming words, only a low, continuous sound of anguish. And still he did not stop. Still he poured the fire into her, because the alternative was a world without her in it. And that was the one thing the king could not survive. By the time the sun began to rise, Cassian was at the edge of a total collapse. His eyes glowed a solid, terrible violet. His muscles were locked rigid with the effort of holding himself human. He had poured so much of the fire into her healing that there was almost nothing left of the man. And then Ren's eyes fluttered open. She was weak, trembling from the ordeal, but the poison was gone. The clarity had come back into her gaze, and the first thing she saw was the state of him, the violet fire in his eyes, the rictus of a mind about to break. She understood at once what he had done. He had nearly destroyed himself to heal her. With a shaking hand, she reached up and pressed her palm against his burning cheek. The cool stillness flooded into him instantly, a rush of glacial peace that swept the wildfire out of his mind. He gasped, shuddered, and collapsed against her, whole again, human again, his forehead pressed to hers. They lay there in the wreckage of the bed, two broken people holding each other together. He had given his sanity to save her body. She had given her stillness to save his mind. "You should not have done that," she whispered. Her voice shook. "You could have lost yourself. Forever. For me." "Yes," he said simply. "Why?" He drew back just far enough to look at her, and his gold eyes were clear now, and steady, and certain. "Because a life without you in it," he said, "is not a life I have any interest in keeping." And in the gray light of the dawn, with the last of the poison gone and the fire finally quiet, neither of them needed to say the rest of it. They had become, somewhere in the fire and the silence, absolutely necessary to one another, two halves of a single, impossible whole. Tiep tuk ban huan thien mo rong, kong dung bat ki dao gach now. The poison had almost taken her, and in the quiet days after, while Ren's strength came slowly back, a question began to grow in the king's mind. Not who is she, but what is she? Because no ordinary wolf could absorb the ravage. No ordinary creature could stand inside an alpha's fury and walk out unburned. No servant girl should have been able to do the impossible not once, but again and again, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. There were no answers in the living. So Cassian went looking among the dead. Deep in the mountain, far above the halls where the pack lived and quarreled, there was a room that smelled of old parchment and centuries of dust. The archive. It was tended by an old wolf named Orin, an archivist so ancient that most of the keep had forgotten he was still alive. He had spent his long years cataloging the forgotten bloodlines of their kind, tracing branches of families that had withered and died long before anyone now breathing had been born. Cassian brought Ren to him, and Orin took one look at her, one long, slow, searching look, and his weathered hands began to tremble. "It cannot be," the old wolf whispered. He circled her the way a man circles something holy. He breathed her in, or tried to, and found the same faint nothing everyone else found, and that faint nothing made his old eyes fill with tears. "You have been looking in the wrong place," he said to the king, his voice cracking. "All of you, looking for what is wrong with her, when you should have been asking what she is." He turned back to Ren. "Child," he said softly, "you are not a ghost because something is broken in you. You are a ghost because you are the last of something the world believed it had lost forever." Then he told them the story. In the earliest days, he said, When wolves were more beast than man, and the great alphas burned too hot to live, the world had made a balance. For every fire, a stillness. For every storm, a shore. They were born rarely, and they were born quiet. Wolves with no scent to give them away. Wolves who could not be commanded, because the ancient authority slid off them like water off glass. Wolves whose touch could pull the excess fury out of a raging king and let it dissolve into nothing. The peacekeepers, the anchors, the only creatures in all the world who could stand beside a ruler at his most dangerous and bring him gently back to himself. And it was never only soothing, Oren added, his voice dropping lower, as though the words themselves were fragile. That is the part the world forgot. The old ones did not merely absorb. They could take. They could draw the stillness out of anything they touched. A raging king. A burning stone. Even the cold iron that tried to cage them. The gift ran in both directions, like a tide. But that knowing died with the last of them. Or, so we all believed. He looked at Ren as he said it, and though she did not understand yet why the words mattered, something in her filed them away, deep in that cool and ancient place that always knew things before her mind caught up. They were treasured once, Oren went on, and then they were hunted. Ren's breath caught. Hunted? The old wolf nodded, grief heavy in the lines of his face, because a rival king feared nothing so much as an enemy who could not be driven mad. A peacekeeper at a rival's side meant a rival who would never burn out, never lose control, never fall to the curse that felled everyone else. So they had been hunted, line by line, family by family. And those few who survived had done so the only way they could. They had hidden. They had bred down into the lowest and most overlooked corners of the pack. They had buried their scent and their gift beneath a veil of perceived weakness, generation after generation, until even they themselves forgot what they were. Until a bloodline built to hold up kings had convinced itself it was nothing at all. The words hit Ren like a physical blow. She reached out and steadied herself against the edge of an ancient table, and the whole of her life seemed to rearrange itself in a single breath. Every year she had spent believing she was less, every corner she had pressed herself into, every gaze that had slid past her, every quiet hour she had spent making herself smaller, because she had believed, all the way down to the marrow, that there was simply less of her to see, and none of it had been true. She had not been a fragment of a person. She had been the missing half of something vast and ancient, a keeper of the peace, born into a body the loud, aggressive world had mistaken for empty. Her silence had never been her weakness. It had always been her strength. She sank down onto an old wooden stool, and she was quiet for a long time, and neither Cassian nor Oren disturbed her, because there was a grief in it, mixed with the wonder, a strange mourning for the girl she had been. For all the years that girl had spent apologizing for taking up space, for all the times she had shrunk herself and lowered her eyes and swallowed the small true things she wanted to say, because she had believed to her very core that a creature like her had no right to be heard. She thought of that girl now with something close to tenderness, and with a fierce, aching anger at a world that had taught her to disappear. All that time, she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper, all that time, I thought there was something wrong with me. I built my whole life around hiding a flaw that was never even a flaw. Cassian crossed the room and knelt in front of her. It was never a flaw, he said. It was the thing the whole world could not survive without, and they were too blind to see it. She looked at him. Including you, she said, not cruelly, only true. He did not flinch from it. Including me, he agreed, for a little while. I looked at you and saw a cure, a useful thing. I am ashamed of it now. His hand found hers. But I see you now, all of you, and I am not going to look away again. Cassian watched her from across the room afterward, and his face was grim. To him, this was not only wonder, it was terror. Because if the world ever learned what she was, every power-hungry ruler alive would come for her. She would be hunted exactly as her ancestors had been, not as a woman, as a prize, as the one thing that could tame the monster inside any king who could seize her. The archive will be sealed, he said, his voice low and hard. Oren, you will speak of this to no one. You will remain under my protection, and this room will be closed. The old wolf bowed his head, and having given her the truth of herself, he stepped back into the shadows of his long-forgotten room and let the story belong to her now. That evening, they walked together on the high wall, the two of them alone beneath a thin and rising moon. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The wind moved cold and clean over the peaks. Somewhere far below, the pines whispered in the dark. You are quiet, Cassian said at last. Even for you, Ren almost smiled. I am trying to decide who I am now, she said. For my whole life, I knew exactly what I was. A ghost, a shadow, a thing that did not matter. It was a small life, but it was mine, and I understood its edges. She looked out at the dark, and now the edges are gone, and I do not know where I end anymore. Cassian was quiet for a moment. When I was a boy, he said, my father told me a thing about the crown. He said the terrible part of power was not the weight of it. It was that once you carry it, you can never set it down and go back to being no one. The world will not let you. He turned to her. You have just picked up a crown of your own, a different kind, and I am sorry for it, because I know exactly how heavy the unwanted kind can be. Do you regret it? She asked. The weight of yours? He considered the question honestly. I did, he said, every day of my life, until you. His gold eyes found hers in the moonlight. Now I think perhaps the weight was never the problem. The problem was carrying it alone. Ren felt something settle in her at that. Because for her whole life, she had believed she had two choices: to stay small and safe and unseen, or to be dragged into the light and destroyed by it. But standing there on the wall, with the wind in her hair and this broken, mended man beside her, she understood there was a third way. She could pick up the weight herself, freely, not because she was forced and not because she was cornered, but because she chose to. Because the free choice of a peacekeeper was the only thing in all the world that could never be taken from her. I am not going to hide anymore, she said. It came out quiet, but it did not waver. Not from Roan, not from the council, not from any of them. I spent 30 years disappearing, and I am done. Cassian looked at her with something like awe. You understand what that will cost, he said softly. If you stand in the light, they will all come for you. Let them come, Ren said. I am not a ghost. I never was. I was only waiting for a reason to stop pretending. And in the cold and rising dark, the king reached out and took the hand of the woman the whole world had overlooked, and he pressed it to his lips, and he understood that she had just become the bravest soul in the entire mountain. Elsewhere in the keep, another soul was making a choice of his own. Damon stood on the battlements in the cold wind, watching the distant torches of Roan's warriors flicker at the edge of the world. And his heart was at war. He had seen the way the king nearly destroyed his own mind to save the girl. He had seen the way Cassian looked at her now, soft and starving, like a man who had found the one thing he could not bear to lose. To Damon, that was not love. That was catastrophe waiting to happen, because he had loved like that once. And he had held that love in his arms as it went cold. He did not hate Ren. That was what made it unbearable. He almost wished he did. He looked at her and saw courage and kindness and something worth saving. He had even, on the wall that night, felt the truth of her words land somewhere deep in him, in a place he had kept sealed for years. But he also saw the shape of the disaster to come. A king so bound to one fragile life that he would burn the world to keep it. A mountain left defenseless the day that life finally ended, as all fragile things eventually end. He believed, with everything in him, that he was the only one clear-eyed enough to see it, and he believed that if the king would not choose the pack over the girl, then the choice would have to be made for him. He went to his quarters. He took up parchment and ink, and though his hand did not shake, something behind his ribs did. He wrote to the High Council of the king's episodes, of the vault, of the seizures in the night, of a ruler grown wholly dependent on a single scentless girl. He framed it all as duty, as love even for the king he could no longer bear to watch drown. He told himself he was saving his people. And perhaps some part of him and believed it, but as he moved to seal the letter, his hand stopped, just for a moment. He thought of the way Ren had lifted her chin in the gallery. I know what it is to be left alone in the dark, and I would not wish it on anyone. He thought of the way she had stood beside him on the wall days ago, and spoken of the girl he had lost with a gentleness no one else had ever offered him. For one long breath, his fingers hovered over the flame, and the letter came so close to the fire, so close. Then he thought of a cold body in his arms, long ago, and the promise he had carved into his own soul in that hour, and his jaw hardened. He handed the sealed letter to a trusted messenger. "Ride hard," he said. "Speak to no one." And as the rider vanished into the night, Damon stood alone on the wall. A man who had just betrayed his king in the name of saving him, and was not at all certain his soul would survive the cost. The council came within days. Their arrival was announced by the low, solemn tolling of the keep's great bells, a sound that froze the blood of every wolf in the courtyard. They had not come to visit. They had come to judge. And as Ren stood at the king's side and watched the gray-robed elders march through the gates with their staves of silver-tipped oak, she felt that cool, ancient warning in her bones sharpen into certainty. The storm she had sensed within these walls had finally arrived, and everything she had only just chosen was about to be tested by fire. The council did not come to listen. They came to weigh a king and find him wanting. 6 elders in gray robes, staves striking the stone in a slow and dreadful rhythm as they circled Cassian in the throne room. They were empaths, all of them, trained to feel the smallest tremor of the ravage the way a hand feels heat rising from a coal. Their leader was a woman named Hestia. Her eyes were as cold as a winter moon. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and final. She told the room that the king could no longer hold his own beast without a crutch, that he had grown dependent on a scentless girl of no standing, that a ruler who could not master his own mind had no right to a throne, and so they would test him. The terms were simple, and they were cruel. Cassian would be separated from Ren, fully. For 2 days and 2 nights, he would be sealed away and subjected to every provocation the council could devise. If he could stand in the dark and the fury with no cool hand to steady him and still come back to himself, then he would keep his crown. But if he shifted, if he lost control even once without her, then the throne would be emptied, one way or another. Ren felt the floor tilt beneath her. She knew what 2 days without her would do to him. She had felt the ravage clawing at him after a single night. She had held him through seizures that would have killed a lesser man. 2 days. It was not a test. It was an execution dressed in the robes of law. Cassian stepped forward, and the heat began to rise off him in waves. "I will not be parted from her," he said, and his voice was the low warning growl of a wolf backed against a wall. "A tether is a partner," Hestia answered, unmoved. "Not a vital organ. You have confused the two, King Cassian, and that confusion is precisely why you can no longer be trusted." The violet began to bleed into his eyes. Ren saw it. She saw his hands curl. She saw the elders tense, saw the silver staves lift a fraction, and she understood in a heartbeat that if he attacked them now, they would put him down where he stood and call it mercy. She placed her hand on his arm. The cool stillness flowed into him, and the violet receded, and she looked up into his eyes and silently begged him, "Please, if we fight them now, we lose everything." He looked down at her, and the agony in his face was terrible to see. The helpless fury of a man who had finally found the one thing worth living for, and was being ordered to let it go. "If I do this," he said very low, meant only for her, "and I fail." "You will not fail," she whispered. "You do not know that." "I do." She pressed her palm harder against him. "Because you are not the monster they think you are. You never were. And I am going to be waiting for you on the other side of it. 2 days. That is all. Come back to me." His jaw worked. His hand came up and covered hers, one last time, and he held it as though he were memorizing it. Then, slowly, he nodded. The guards moved between them, and the moment their hands were pulled apart, Ren felt it. A hollow, aching void opening in the center of her chest, as though something had been torn out by the root. She was led one way, toward a high tower, its walls lined with silver to smother her gift and leave her small and powerless. Cassian was led the other, down, toward the pits where his trial would begin. At the threshold, he turned back to look at her one final time, and then the heavy doors closed between them, and the world went quiet in the worst possible way. The tower was a cruelty all its own. The silver in the walls pressed against Ren's cool inner pulse, muffling it, making her feel for the first time in her life ordinary, weak, cut off from the ancient stillness that had always been her secret strength. She paced. She strained her ears for any sound from the pits far below. She knew what he was enduring down there. She knew the ravage would be hitting him like a tidal wave with no shore to break against. Every minute stretched into an hour. Hold on, she thought, over and over. Hold on. I am coming back to you. She did not yet know that she would never make it to the end of the trial. Late in the first night, the door to her chamber creaked open. Wren turned, expecting a guard with a plate of cold food. Instead, Damon stepped from the shadows. He looked wrong. The stoic mask was gone, and in its place was a dark, frantic intensity. The look of a man who had walked a long way down a road he could not walk back from. His hand rested on the hilt of his blade, and Wren understood, with a jolt of ice down her spine, that the council's trial had never been the last move. "You should have run," Damon said quietly. "When you had the chance, back when you were still no one, I would have let you go." "Damon, he will fail the trial." His voice cracked. "Without you, he will go feral before the second dawn, and when he does, the council will end him, and the pack will finally be free of this sickness." "This is not freedom," Wren said. "This is murder. This is the only way I know how to save them." He took a step toward her, and Wren saw, even now, even in this, that he was weeping. "You loved someone," she said softly, "and you lost her to a wolf who could not hold his beast. You told me that yourself, on the wall. You trusted me with it." Damon froze. "Do not," he whispered. "You are not a cruel man, Damon." Her voice was gentle, and it did not tremble, even now. "You are a grieving one, and grief has been telling you lies for years. It told you that the only way to keep your promise was to become the very thing that broke you. But she would not have wanted this. Whoever she was, she would not have wanted you to become a man who strikes down frightened women in the dark." His face crumpled. For one long, terrible breath, the blade wavered in his hand, and something like hope flickered in Wren's chest. She thought she had reached him. But grief carved that deep does not let go so easily. "You do not understand," he said, and his voice was breaking. "If I let him keep you, and I am wrong, then everyone dies. Everyone. And it will be because I was too weak to do the hard thing twice." He drew a shaking breath. "I could not save her, but I can save them. That is all I have left. Do you see? It is the only thing I have left." "Damon, please." "Forgive me," he whispered, and he moved. He was fast, faster than her ordinary eyes could follow, and the pommel of his sword struck her temple, and the world spun sideways into black before she even felt herself fall. When she woke, she was no longer in the tower. She was somewhere cold and damp, a place that smelled of stagnant water and old iron and the aggressive musk of strange wolves. Chains of silver bound her wrists, biting into her skin, drinking her strength away drop by drop. Through a small barred window high in the wall, she could see the sky. And the sky was wrong. It was deepening, bruising. The moon rising toward its full height and turning slowly, a deep and terrible red, a blood moon. Damon had not simply taken her from the king. He had delivered her to Roan. Far away, down in the trial pits, Cassian felt the exact moment she was taken. The thin psychic thread that connected them did not fade. It was ripped out of him. He collapsed to his knees, and a sound tore from his throat that was not a roar and not a scream, but something older and worse than both. The last wall in his mind, the one her memory had been holding up, crumbled into dust, and the ravage surged forward to fill the empty space. The pits shattered. The council members watching from behind the reinforced glass recoiled as a wave of pure kinetic fury slammed against it. Cassian was not shifting into a wolf. He was becoming something older. A nightmare of ancient proportions, his bones groaning as they expanded, violet fire pouring from his eyes so bright it left afterimages burned on the air. The silver shackles that could hold a king were not built to hold a force of nature. He ripped his arms free, the metal screaming, and he did not feel the skin he left on the iron. He felt only the burning void where his mate had been. Hestia screamed for the guards. They did not move. They could not. No warrior alive could make his body walk toward a thing like that. Cassian hit the great vault door shoulder first, and the reinforced steel gave way like paper, the whole frame collapsing into the corridor in a cloud of dust and twisted metal. He moved through the keep like a storm made of shadow and heat. He did not stop to fight the guards who tried to block his path. He simply moved through them, his momentum tossing armored men aside like dead leaves. Every breath was a snarl. His mind had narrowed to a single burning point. Find her, and destroy anything that stands in the way. He caught the trail of her scent at the outer walls, tangled with the copper reek of Damon's betrayal. They had taken her off the mountain, into the cold, toward the place where Roan's wolves were waiting. He did not hesitate. He vaulted the high battlements, his massive form silhouetted for one terrible instant against the rising blood moon. And then he was gone, plummeting into the dark, hitting the forest floor at a dead run, locked onto the distant scent of the woman who held his soul. The forest tried to stop him. Roan had not left the road unguarded. Warriors waited among the trees, a full score of them, seasoned killers set there for exactly this. They came at the king out of the dark with spears and blades, expecting to slow him, to wound him, to buy their master time. They may as well have thrown themselves against an avalanche. Cassian did not slow. He did not even seem to see them as men. He tore through the ambush like weather, like something that had no business existing in a world of flesh and steel. And behind him he left a trail through the trees that the survivors would speak of in fearful whispers for the rest of their short lives. He was grief given a body. He was every year of loneliness and every hour of caged rage, unleashed at last with a single purpose. And nothing in that dark forest was built to stand in the way of a thing like that. By the time he reached the canyon where Roan's fortress crouched in the dark, the blood on him was not his own, and the last of the man had all but drowned beneath the fire. In the cold cell of Roan's fortress, Ren pulled against her chains. The silver drank her strength, and her head throbbed where Damon had struck her, and the blood moon climbed higher and redder through the little barred window. She could feel the change in the air, the pull of the full eclipse drawing closer, thickening. She knew what it meant. Somewhere out there, Cassian was losing himself to the final and permanent stage of the ravage. And this time, There was no cool hand within reach to pull him back. This time, if the moon went fully dark before she reached him, he would be lost forever. And here was the moment that would decide everything. Because the old wren, the ghost, the servant, the girl who waited in shadows for the world to act upon her, that wren would have wept and pulled uselessly at her chains and prayed for someone to come and save her. But that wren was gone. She had made a choice in the archive. She had made a choice on the wall under the thin, cold moon. She had chosen to matter. She had chosen him. And a choice like that does not lie down and wait to be rescued. Then Oren's words surfaced from that dusty room that felt like a lifetime ago. They could draw the stillness out of anything they touched, even the cold iron that tried to cage them. Wren went very still. She closed her eyes, and she reached, not outward against the chains, but inward, down into that cool and ancient pulse at the center of her, the peacekeeper's stillness. The thing the silver was trying so hard to smother. The silver drank her energy, so she stopped fighting it, and she drank back. She turned the ancient gift inside out. Instead of pouring her stillness away to soothe another, she pulled. She drew the cold energy out of the silver itself, the same way she had always drawn the fire out of Cassian, absorbing it, unmaking it, letting it dissolve into the endless quiet at her core. The chains grew brittle. Frost bloomed across the metal, and with a sound like breaking ice, the silver shattered and fell away from her wrists. Wren rose to her feet in the dark. For the first time in her life, she had not waited to be freed. She had freed herself. And now she turned toward the sound of chaos beyond the cell door. The crash of steel, the frantic shouts, the wet and rhythmic sound of a slaughter, the long and sorrowful howl of a beast tearing a fortress apart to reach her. He was coming. But the man was almost gone. The cell door was struck from the outside. Once, twice. On the third blow, the lock shattered and the door tore from its hinges and skidded across the stone. And Cassian filled the doorway. He was covered in the blood of his enemies. His chest heaved with a predatory rasp, and his eyes were no longer amber. They were swirling vortices of violet fire that looked through her rather than at her. He took a slow step into the cell, claws clicking on stone. He did not know her. The beast had won. Above them, through the shattered roof of the fortress, the shadow of the earth slid across the last sliver of the moon, and the world went dark red. The total eclipse, the peak, the moment the ravage would burn away the last of his humanity forever, or not at all. Wren did not run. She did not shrink against the wall the way the old ghost would have. She walked toward him, toward the blood and the violet fire and the towering nightmare that had once been a man, toward the very thing that every instinct screamed at her to flee. "Cassian," she said softly. The beast snarled, a sound that shook dust from the ceiling. "I know you are in there." She kept walking. "I know you can hear me. You came all this way. You tore the world apart to reach me. That was not the monster. That was you." He lunged. His hand closed around her, bruising, lifting her half off her feet, and for one heartbeat, she thought he would crush the life from her. But she did not fight the grip. She reached up instead, and she threw her arms around his neck, and she pressed her face into the burning hollow of his throat, And then she did the thing no peacekeeper in all their long and hunted history had ever dared. She did not merely touch him. She opened. She reached into the deepest well of her heritage, into the ancient silence that had slept in her blood for 100 generations, and she let it flood out of her, not as a hand laid on a fevered brow, but as a total and complete surrender, wrapping the raging king in a blanket of absolute, endless stillness. The ravage poured into her, all of it, a jagged, screaming torrent of fire and grief and ancient pain, 100 years of accursed bloodline's agony crashing into her small frame all at once. It should have destroyed her. She held. She trembled, and her knees buckled, and still she held, pouring peace into him as fast as he poured fury into her, refusing to let go. "I have you," she whispered into his burning skin, over and over, the way she had that first night by the bed. "I have you. Come back. Come back to me. I am not letting go. Not now. Not ever." And as the shadow swallowed the last of the moon, a blinding flash of silver light erupted from the place where their skin met. Not fire, not violet. Silver. It was not a light the eyes could see so much as one the soul could feel. A psychic explosion that leveled every last wall between them. In that instant, Ren saw the whole history of his cursed line, all its pain and all its loneliness. She saw the boy who had grown up waiting to be put down, the man who had spent every night braced for a lonely death. And Cassian saw her, truly saw her, the quiet, unbreakable strength of the girl who had always been his destiny, standing in his fire without fear, choosing him even now, even at the very end of the world. The null gene and the ravage did not cancel each other. They merged. The violet fire in his eyes began to swirl with soft, ethereal silver, the two colors dancing together, twisting, blending, until they settled into a clear and brilliant gold. The swelling of his monstrous form receded. His bones slid back into place with a painless, fluid grace. The killing heat cooled into a gentle warmth, and the frantic, broken rhythm of his heart slowed, steadied, became strong. He drew one long, shuddering breath. His grip on her softened, and his arms wrapped around her, and he pulled her against his chest with a tenderness that brought tears spilling down her face. He looked down at her, and his eyes were entirely, wholly human. Clear gold, no violet anywhere in them, no fire, no beast. Only him, only the man. "You came into the dark," he whispered, his voice raw and wondering. "You walked straight into it. For me." "I told you," Ren breathed, her hand rising to his cheek, and this time there was no fever there to cool, only warmth. "I told you I would be waiting on the other side." And there, in the ruins of an enemy fortress, beneath a moon slowly returning to silver, the king and the ghost held each other in a silence deeper and more perfect than either of them had ever known. Not the empty silence of the tower, not the terrible silence of the vault, but the sacred, unbreakable quiet of two broken souls, at last made whole. The girl no one had ever seen had walked into the darkest fire in the world, and she had carried them both out of it. The mountain had never seen a homecoming like it. Word of what had happened at the fortress traveled faster than the two of them could ride. By the time the king came back through his own gates, the people were already gathered, lining the courtyard in hushed and reverent crowds, They had braced for the return of a broken man, or worse, for the return of no man at all, only a beast or a corpse, or the silence of a throne gone empty. Instead, they got a legend. Cassian rode through the gates with Ren seated before him on his great horse, his arm wrapped around her, his hand never once leaving hers. And the pack fell silent at the sight of him, because the king who returned was not the one who had left. The restless fever was gone from his eyes. The scorched edge had left his scent, softened to something deep and clean and steady. He carried a calm the mountain had not felt in 1,000 years, a stillness so profound that the wolves in the courtyard felt it settle over their own frantic hearts like a hand laid gently on a shoulder. He was whole, and everyone could see it. But it was not the king they could not stop looking at. It was the woman. They had watched her for years without ever truly seeing her. A gray thing in the corners, a bucket and a cloth and a bowed head. A presence so faint it was easier to forget she was there at all. And now she sat before their king like she had been carved to belong there. And the strange thing, the thing that made the breath catch in 100 throats, was that it was true. She did belong. She always had. They simply had not had the eyes to see it. The High Council waited in the courtyard, their gray robes stark against the pale stone, their staves trembling faintly in their hands. They had prepared for an execution. They had come to this mountain to end a king who could not hold his own beast, and now they watched him dismount and help the scentless girl down with a tenderness no one could mistake, and stand before them with the clear gold eyes of a man who had walked through the worst fire in the world and come out the other side, master of himself at last. Hestia stepped forward. Her cold winter moon eyes were, for the first time, uncertain. She opened her mouth to speak the words of the trial, and Cassian looked at her. Just looked, and whatever she had meant to say died in her throat. "The trial is over," he said. His voice was quiet. It did not need to be anything else. "You came to see whether I could master the storm. Look at me, Hestia. Look, all of you, and tell me what you see." The elders looked, and they felt it. The deep and unshakable calm rolling off him in waves. The total absence of the ravage that had haunted his bloodline since the beginning of their kind. It was gone. Not caged, not suppressed, not held at bay by a trembling hand. Gone. "How?" Hestia whispered. Cassian drew Ren gently to his side, and he did not let go of her hand, and he made his answer a public thing, so that every wolf in the courtyard would hear it. "The storm did not need a stronger cage," he said. "It never did. It needed a shore to break against. And she is that shore." He looked down at Ren, and something in his face softened past all recognition. "You called her a crutch. You called her a weakness. You were wrong. She is not the thing that makes me less." His voice rose, clear and certain, carrying to the farthest corner of the courtyard. "She is the thing that made me whole." The council had no answer for that. There was no law for it, no precedent. No gray-robed elder in all their long history had ever seen the ravage healed rather than contained. They had come to judge a broken king, and they had found a mended one, and the finding left them with nothing to say. Hestia looked at Ren for a long moment, and then, slowly, the leader of the High Council did a thing that had not been done in the memory of anyone living. She inclined her head. To a scentless girl of no standing, to a servant, to a ghost, she bowed. And so the throne was safe. But there was still the matter of the man who had tried to empty it. Damon was brought before the king in chains. They had found him at the edge of the territory, hollow-eyed and unresisting, a man who had run out of a road long before he ever reached its end. He had not fled far. Perhaps he had not truly been trying to escape at all. Perhaps some part of him had simply been waiting for the judgment he knew was coming. He was made to kneel in the great hall, and Ren watched, standing at Cassian's side, as the king looked down at the warrior who had struck her, who had chained her, who had handed her to their greatest enemy, and left his own king to burn. The whole hall waited for the sentence of death. It was the only sentence that made sense. Cassian's hand tightened around hers. She could feel the old heat trying to rise in him, not the ravage now, but simple human fury. The rage of a man looking at the person who had nearly cost him everything he loved. And Ren understood that this too was a kind of test, not of his power, of his heart. But before Cassian could speak, Ren did something no one expected. She let go of his hand, and she stepped down, alone, toward the kneeling man in chains. The hall went utterly still. Damon lifted his head, and when he saw who was approaching him, something broke across his face, shame and confusion, and a grief so old and heavy it seemed to bend his shoulders under its weight. He had expected the king's wrath. He had not expected her. "You were not wrong to be afraid," Ren said softly. Damon flinched as though she had struck him. "You loved someone, and you held her while she died, because a wolf could not master his own beast." Her voice did not waver. "And you swore you would never let that happen to anyone again. That is not the heart of a traitor, Damon. That is the heart of a man who was never allowed to set his grief down." Damon's eyes filled. "I would have let him kill you," he whispered brokenly. "I did let them take you. How can you stand there and speak to me with kindness? Because I know what it is," Ren said, "to be so afraid of losing something that you make yourself into a thing you do not recognize." She knelt so that they were eye to eye. "You did a terrible thing, and you will answer for it. But you did it out of love and out of a wound that no one ever helped you heal. I will not pretend those are the same as cruelty. They are not." The whole hall was silent, and Cassian, watching his mate kneel before the man who had betrayed them both and speak to him with mercy instead of hatred, felt something shift inside him. Because the old Cassian, the one from before the vault, would have torn Damon apart without a second thought, would have made it fast and brutal and final, and called it justice. But that king had ruled through fear, and fear, he understood now, watching Ren, was the very thing that had nearly destroyed them all. Cassian stepped down from the dais. He came to stand beside Ren, and he looked at the man who had been his second, his right hand, his friend, before grief had twisted him into something else. "I should kill you," Cassian said. Damon bowed his head. "Yes, the old law demands it. And there was a time, not long ago, when I would have been glad to obey it." He was quiet a moment. "But that king is dead. He burned away in a fortress under a red moon. And the one who walked out of the fire has learned something the old one never understood. He crouched, bringing himself level with the kneeling man. Strength is not the power to make others afraid, Cassian said. I ruled this mountain through terror for my whole life, and all it ever bought me was loneliness. A pack that obeyed me and never once loved me. A hall full of wolves who told me what my power demanded, and never what was true. His gaze flicked to Ren. She could never be commanded, and so everything she ever gave me was real. That is what taught me. Real strength is not being feared. It is being seen, and choosing to see others in return, even when it would be so much easier to look away. Damon was weeping now, silently, the tears cutting tracks down a face that had forgotten how. I do not offer you death, Cassian said. That would be the easy thing, for both of us. He rose. You are stripped of your rank. You are banished from this mountain, to live out your days in the far country, alone with what you have done. It is a harder sentence than the blade, but it is not without mercy. He paused. And should you ever find, out there in your exile, that you have finally set your grief down, that you have become again the man you were before you lost her. His voice softened, just slightly. Then these gates will not be forever closed to you. Damon looked up, stunned. It was more than he had dared to hope for, far more than he deserved, and he knew it. And the knowing broke something open in him that a death sentence never could have reached. Why? He rasped, and it was Ren who answered. Because everyone deserves the chance to become better than the worst thing they ever did, she said. Even you. Especially you. They led him out through the gates, and as he went, Damon paused at the threshold and turned back, one last time, and he looked at the scentless girl standing beside the king. He had called her a parasite, a poison, a weakness, and she had answered him with the only thing that had ever had a chance of reaching a man drowning in that much grief. She had answered him with mercy. He bowed to her, a true bow this time, deep and full and free of any hidden blade. And then he walked out into the far country, a broken man carrying, for the first time in years, the smallest and most fragile seed of hope. In the days that followed, the whole mountain seemed to exhale. Something had changed in the air of the keep, and it was not only the absence of the ravage, it was the way the pack began to look at one another, as if a whole people, watching their king choose mercy over fear, had quietly begun to wonder what else they had been overlooking, who else they had passed by, whose quiet strength they had mistaken for nothing. The gray corridors where Ren had once moved unseen felt different now, and the lowest servants, the forgotten ones, the ones who kept their eyes on the floor, began, very slowly, to lift their heads. Because if a ghost could become a queen, then perhaps none of them were quite as invisible as they had been taught to believe. There was one who found her the very next morning, Myron, the old servant with worn hands, who had bowed and called her my lady, and would not meet her eyes. She came to the door of the royal wing, and she hovered there, twisting her apron in her hands. And when Ren looked up and smiled at her, the old woman's face crumpled. I turned away from you, Mirren said. When you needed a friend most, I bowed, and I called you a name, and I left you alone in that great cold room. I have been ashamed of it every day since." Wren crossed the room and took the old woman's twisting hands in both of hers, stilling them. "You were only doing what the world taught you," Wren said gently. "The same way it taught me to disappear. Neither of us made those rules, Myron, but we do not have to keep them." And she drew the old woman into an embrace, servant and queen, the way they had once sat together over quiet meals in the hall below. And Mirren wept against her shoulder, and something that had been broken between them was quietly, kindly, made whole. It was a small thing, but Wren had spent her whole life learning that the small things were never small at all. The coronation took place at sunset. The dying light turned the stone of the keep to shimmering amber, and the whole pack gathered in the great courtyard. And this time, there were no whispers, no sharp glances, no resentment coiling in the corners of the room. There was only awe, because they all knew now what she had done. They knew she had walked into an enemy fortress in chains, that she had freed herself when no one came, that she had walked unafraid into the heart of the ravage at the very peak of the blood moon, and had carried their king back from a darkness no one had ever returned from. The ghost they had all overlooked had saved them all. Cassian stood at the edge of the high balcony, his crown glinting in the amber light. But no one was looking at the crown. Every eye was on the woman beside him. Wren wore a gown of silver and white, and she no longer stood like a shadow trying to disappear. She stood tall, steady, radiant with a quiet light that filled the whole courtyard without ever needing to raise its voice. The girl who had spent her life pressing herself into corners now stood at the very center of the world, and she did not flinch from it. Cassian turned to face his people. "For 1,000 years," he said, "this mountain has been ruled by fear, by strength measured in how loudly a wolf could roar and how many it could make tremble. I was raised to believe that was the only kind of power worth having." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong." He took Wren's hand. "The strongest creature I have ever known makes no sound at all. She has no scent to announce her, no command to bend others to her will. For her whole life, this pack looked straight through her and called her nothing." His voice hardened, just slightly. "We were fools, all of us, because the truth is that she was the most powerful soul among us the entire time, and we could not see it, because we were only ever looking for the loud kind of strength." He turned to her then, there in front of all his people. "You spent your life being unseen," he said quietly, meant for her and yet heard by all. "Being overlooked, being told in 1,000 small ways that you did not matter." His hand tightened around hers. "Let this be the answer to every one of those years." And there, in the amber light of the dying sun, he named her, not consort, not tether, not tool. Queen, the Queen of Silence, the first peacekeeper in all their long and bloody history to sit upon a throne, the last of a hunted line, lifted at last out of the shadows and into the light where she had always belonged. The whole pack knelt. Every wolf in the courtyard, from the highest elder to the lowest servant, bowed their heads to the woman they had once refused to see, and Wren stood above them all, this girl who had been a ghost, and let herself, for the first time in her life, be fully, completely seen. There were tears on her face, not of sorrow, of something she did not have a word for. the feeling of a lifetime of invisibility finally ending, the feeling of being known and wanted and honored exactly as she was, the very thing she had stopped letting herself hope for so long ago that she had forgotten it was ever a hope at all. She thought of the small gray woman who had walked those cold lower corridors, sure that she was nothing, sure that the most she could ever be was useful, and she wished with a sudden ache that she could reach back and tell that woman the truth. You were never nothing. You were only waiting for a world that could finally see you. The celebration lasted deep into the night. There was music and firelight, and a kind of laughter the old keep had not heard in generations. The wolves who had once looked through Wren now sought her out, one by one, to bow, to thank her, to press her hand, and tell her, in halting words, that they were sorry for all the years they had failed to see her. And Wren received each of them with grace. She did not hold their old blindness against them. She, of all people, understood how easy it was to look at a quiet thing and assume there was nothing there. She had believed it about herself for most of her life. But there was one moment, near the end of the night, that she would carry with her always. A young servant girl, small and gray and silent, hovering at the very edge of the firelight, watching the new queen with wide and wondering eyes. A girl who thought she was nothing. A girl who thought the best she could hope for was to not be noticed. Wren crossed the courtyard to her. She knelt down so that they were eye to eye, and she took the startled girl's small hands in her own. "I see you," Wren said softly. The girl's breath caught. "Whatever they have told you, however small they have made you feel, however sure you are that you do not matter." Wren's voice was gentle and certain and warm. "It is not true. Do you hear me? It was never true." She squeezed the small hands in hers. The quietest soul in the room is very often the one holding everything together. You were not put here to disappear, so do not let anyone teach you how. And she watched something kindle in the girl's eyes, a small light, a first fragile beginning of a belief that might, one day, grow into a whole life. That, Wren thought, as she rose and watched the girl straighten her shoulders and lift her chin, that was the real crown. Not the title, not the throne, not the bowing council or the roaring feast, but the chance to reach back through the shadows and tell some other forgotten soul the thing that no one had ever told her. That night, in the privacy of their chambers, the silence was at last perfect. No nightmares waited in the dark, no tremors of the wolf, no fear of what the night might bring. Cassian pulled her into his arms and rested his forehead against hers, and for a long while they simply listened to the wind moving through the peaks. "I spent my whole life," he murmured, "believing that power was a burden I had to carry alone, that to be strong was to need no one." His thumb traced slow circles against her back. "You taught me the opposite, that true strength is not in never needing anyone. It is in being brave enough to be held." Wren smiled against his chest. Her fingers traced the faded scars there, the old wounds of a cursed and lonely life, scars that no longer pained him now. "And you taught me," she said softly, "that being quiet was never the same as being small." She lifted her head and looked up at him, at the clear gold eyes that held no storm anymore, only warmth, only her, All those years I thought I had to vanish to be safe. I thought the most I could ever be was unnoticed. Her voice was steady and sure. But that was never true either. Not for me. Not for any of us. He kissed her then, slow and deep and unhurried, the kiss of a man who had all the time in the world now, and meant to spend every moment of it well. And when he drew back, he looked at her the way he had looked at her that first night in the vault, when the fire had drained from his eyes and he had seen her, truly seen her, for the first time. Except now, there was no fear in it, only wonder, only a love that had been forged in the worst fire the world could offer, and had come out the other side unbreakable. They had survived the fire, the storm, the betrayal, the long red night when the whole world hung by a single fragile thread. And what they had built out of all of it was not loud. It made no proclamations. It asked nothing of anyone. It was only this: a warm hand in the dark, freely given, a silence that no longer frightened a soul in the whole mountain. Two people who had each been so certain they were meant to be alone, and had been so completely, so mercifully wrong. In the years that came after, they say the mountain changed. The pack that had once been ruled through terror became something gentler and stranger and stronger for it. The forgotten were sought out. The quiet ones were listened to. And the lowest servant in the deepest corridor knew that if she had something to say, there was a queen upon the throne who would kneel down and hear it. They called her the Queen of Silence. But her silence was never emptiness. It was the deep and steady stillness of a soul that had finally come home to itself. The quiet of still water that holds the whole sky in its face. The quiet of a shore that takes the fury of the storm and gives back only peace. And far away, in the cold and lonely country beyond the borders, they say a banished warrior heard of it too, of a mountain that had learned to be kind, of a queen who forgave the man who had wronged her, and in a small rough shelter under a wide and empty sky, an exile who had carried his grief for longer than he could remember finally, quietly, set it down, and began the long walk back toward the man he had been before he lost her. Whether he ever reached the gates again, the story does not say, but it says that he tried, and sometimes the trying is the whole of the redemption. And on the coldest nights, when the wind came howling down through the peaks, the king and his queen would stand together at the high window and look out over a kingdom at rest, his storm forever stilled, her silence forever heard. Two halves of an ancient balance the world had tried so hard to break and had never quite managed to erase. Outside, the wind whispered through the peaks, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the great mountain keep was truly, perfectly at peace.